The shockwaves being sent by the arrest of famed Olympian charged with murdering his glamorous model girlfriend in the wee hours of this Valentine's Day morning.
Paralympian Oscar Pistorius has been arrested for allegedly killing his girlfriend.
Police say Steenkamp was shot 4 times with a 9mm pistol.
Riva had already died whilst I was holding her.
He ought to have been convicted not of culpable homicide on that count, but of murder.
Hello and welcome to Real Crime Profile. This is Jim Clemente, retired FBI profiler and former New York City prosecutor, as well as current writer and producer for CBS's Criminal Minds. With me today is...
I'm Laura Richards. I'm former New Scotland Yard and trained at the FBI, and also co-founder and director of Paladin, the National Stalking Advocacy Service.
And I'm Lisa Zambetti, CSA. I'm the casting director for Criminal Minds and Beyond Borders. And I work with Jim Clemente. He writes and I cast for killers, victims, and everything in between.
Well, today we're going back to the case of Oscar Pistorius' murder of Riva Steenkamp. And the reason why we're talking about this is because Oscar is getting resentenced. He was originally convicted of what basically amounts to criminally negligent homicide, and then an appeals court decided that based on the evidence that was proven in the court, that he was actually guilty of murder. So Laura and I had been discussing this before we started Real Crime Profile, and we were very happy to find that the Supreme Court of Appeals, which is made up of a panel of 15 judges, have found that actually the evidence proven in this case actually made out a case for murder rather than criminally negligent homicide. So there's been a lot of things going on lately, and I just want to start with the biggest stunt that Oscar pulled in court recently, and that was a plea for pity from the court and from the public, because he wanted to show them what it was like walking on his stumps. This is complete and total bullshit, because what he did was he walked on the end of his stumps, which is not how he walks, and in fact runs around in his home. By his own testimony, he ran down the hall towards the bathroom. He didn't do that on the ends of his stump, like as if they were stilts. He did that on his knees, on his bent knees, with the stumps forming sort of a backward facing foot. So it actually gives him balance. And he's actually very good at it, and he's been doing it his entire life. And to have him get up in court and then wobble around on the ends of his stump looking like a pathetic fellow was just a complete act. One more in his long series of acts that he pulled off during the trial. His, I believe, his crying, the hysterical lead up to his screaming out, what he said to the would-be burglars or robbers. All that stuff, I think, was a bunch of stunts that he pulled in court just to help get people to feel sorry for him and not convict him.
Well, and more importantly, the judge. And I think, it's an interesting point, isn't it? This is the same judge that decided to give him, who decided that on all the evidence that she had heard, that this was a case of culpable homicide. And of course, then he had a much shorter sentence. I think he was in the sort of the hospital side of the prison for less than 12 months, and then he was on house arrest at his uncle's. But this is the same judge who's going to now make the decision. So I find that a very interesting thing. How is she going to make that decision when she's already made one decision? It's been 15 judges have said, no, that's not the right one. And she knows that she's got a minimum of 15 years, but she's probably going to have to try and find some balance here. And of course, Pistorius and his defence team know that. And what they're playing to is they're still appealing to her to come down on the lesser side around his vulnerability, his health care, i.e. if he goes back in and into maybe a hospital setting rather than the full prison. Ugh. And the vulnerability part is what he's playing to. And the psychologist coming out, I mean, I listened to that and I found it very, very difficult when the psychologist is talking about how broken he is and that he's depressed and, all these things that we would expect him to be.
Meanwhile, Riva is dead. All right? I mean, it's just outrageous that unfortunately, I think you're right. The judge might actually buy this crap, but it is an absolute lie to say that he is vulnerable when he's walking around on his stumps, when in fact he, by his own testimony, can run on his knees. He can get around without any problem. He's very stable. It's just, like I said, one more stunt that he's pulled.
Absolutely. But this is a guy who's fighting for his life. He knows he's in with a chance to get a much shorter sentence. And the same, I was looking on Twitter and I was pretty horrified to see some staged photos that were on there of him lying, supposedly asleep on a sofa with children, that his nieces and nephews and other children, maybe they rounded up and being plonked on him. I'd defy anybody to sleep underneath all those children that equally look so uncomfortable. And, his brot's trying to make out, this is a family man.
What?
Why are kids on top of him while he's sleeping anyway? I mean, that's pretty disturbing, actually. It doesn't sound like something that I think should be done in the first place.
So his brother Carl is basically saying, after a really tough day in court, he's so exhausted, poor Oscar, that he's fallen asleep with all these, the family around him. So again, they're trying to paint this picture of the family man, all these children who are going to miss him. Yeah, of course, it's all for purpose, and it looks, we talk about staged crime scenes, where these was, staged photos.
Right, and if you haven't heard our previous episode about Riva Steenkamp and her text messages back and forth with Oscar Pistorius, you should listen to that, because it really sets the stage for this kind of crap. Because, in fact, the man was very demanding. The man was very controlling. Don't talk that way. Don't use that accent. Don't chew gum. Over and over and over again. And this was in a very short period of time. They were only dating for 4 months, right?
Yeah, and that's a significant part to this.
And she was afraid of him. All right, she stated it. It was deliberate. He didn't say, "You have nothing to fear," when he responded to those things. She and he were going through back and forth, and basically in a very short period of time, he tried to exert complete control over her, and she was fighting against that, and he didn't like it one bit.
And there were some other things we didn't talk about in the last episode that we did, which was her adopted family in Johannesburg. Basically said, I think it's Cecile and Desi, basically said that when Oscar first started dating her, the very first time he went into the address, and talked to both of them, and thereafter he was just sat outside, whenever he went round there, just on the horn, like beeping the horn, as if to say, come on, come out, I'm here waiting.
He's a real gentleman,
yeah,
in other words.
Exactly. Not even affording the family a common courtesy.
Oh.
Right.
But the father basically said that he became obsessed very quickly. And other people might use that word again, infatuation, which I think we need to be really careful when we hear that word.
It's a major difference.
There's a major difference. But other people talked about obsession, and certainly June, her mother, her actual blood mother, maternal mother, said that he was very controlling towards her, and he was telling her what to wear and how to behave and how to act. And a mother has a different insight as well, when particularly mothers and daughters, and when they were close and she was talking about the relationship. So mum did have an insight into this relationship,
right,
as did some other friends, about how tantrumous and how he would behave towards her.
Right, and these are important details. We're trying to get people to realize that you can't just go by the smiles on their faces or how good somebody looks or how famous somebody is. People can do really extremely devious things in the privacy of their own relationship. And there are people who don't want to admit that Oscar Pistorius may have been a really bad person. But guess what? He's been convicted of murder for a reason. This was proven in a court of law. Despite the judge not wanting to, the number one court in that land has spoken, and they said he's guilty of murder. And you should then take that into account. Use that as the context when you then look at the behavior that he exhibited over time.
And there, in that particular trial, just some stats about the trial, because we're going to talk about the crime scene first, but just talking about how many people, made a decision. Well, the judge, also, the trial lasted 49 days, but there were 37 witnesses who took the stand. And there's one particular witness I want us to talk about when we get there, which is Samantha Taylor, which is a previous partner of Oscar Pistorius's. But, he was still found guilty of culpable homicide and unlawfully killing her. And, of course, now that's been up to murder. And as I said before, the minimum sentence is 15 years. But I think this could be an anomaly. I think we could end up seeing a judge doing lesser. And of course, a sentence in the US for homicide, Jim, what's the maximum that you would get?
Well, I mean, a lot of times for homicide, for murder,
distinguish
homicide,
the two, just
yeah,
because we don't have that distinction.
Got it. So in the U.S., homicide is when any human being kills another. There are legitimate homicides, there are criminally negligent homicides, and there are murders. And that is when somebody illegally, intentionally kills somebody else. So,
and then there are degrees of. That's
yes,
the bit that we don't have.
Right. So in murder, there are second-degree murder and first-degree murder. Second-degree murder would be something where there is no indication that it was premeditated or pre-planned. There are no exacerbating circumstances. First-degree murder is when somebody premeditates and pre-plans a murder. Jodi Arias might be a good example. And then also it's when there's particularly grievous violence involved and mutilation and so on and so forth, that can also be first-degree murder.
And, you know, of course, now when people are seeing sort of the various acts of showmanship from Pistorius, shall we call it, across this week, I mean, some may not remember what actually happened in terms of the crime itself, the night of the crime. Certainly what the first detective, somebody called Detective Botha, who went to the scene, he got there at about 4 o'clock in the morning, what he says about it. And then, of course, it would be interesting, I think, for some, if we talk about what was said in court in terms of what the defence said went down and how it happened. And, of course, there's a big difference in those two accounts.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start with the crime scene for that particular night.
For people who aren't familiar with this case, so we're in South Africa. It's Valentine's Day, and we've covered that there's a relationship between basically a big celebrity, Oscar Pistorius, and his model, beautiful girlfriend, Riva. And Laura?
And who had a law degree, and we talked about Riva specifically. She was 29 years old at the time, and it was a 4-month relationship. And that context, as Jim mentioned earlier, is extremely important, that they had only been dating for a very short time. But that particular night, and if we talk about Detective Hilton Botha's account, because I paid quite a lot of attention to him, being the first person on the scene.
Okay, that's a great idea. So right after this break, we'll come back and talk about the crime scene. Hello, it's Jim Clementi and Francie Hakes with a special message about a new show that I'm hosting on Wondery called Locked Up Abroad. In each episode, people tell their harrowing stories of being convicted of crimes and jailed in foreign lands, or kidnapped and held hostage in war-torn countries.
These are definitely worst-case scenarios. They're truly frightening situations.
Yes, no best cases here.
But it is fascinating to hear how they manage to survive these ordeals.
In the first episode, Midnight Express, Billy Hayes tells us about being imprisoned in Turkey for smuggling hashish. Oliver Stone even made a movie about it. But that was the movie. This is the real story. I even had the chance to interview Billy Hayes recently, and he told me the whole story behind the story of how he escaped a Turkish prison. He even told me that he went back to Turkey years later. You have to hear his story to believe it.
And now, in his own words, here is Billy Hayes.
All right, we're back from our break, and Laura's going to bring us through the initial crime scene assessment.
Yeah, well, let's talk about it. I mean, certainly from what Hilton Botha said, he attended the address at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the address is quite important in and of itself because of the security and everything that was afforded to that particular gated community.
I was going to say, it was a gated community like we're familiar with here.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and, you know, it had very high fences, and there were motion sensors on the fences. There was barbed wire at the top of it. There was security detail there as well. You know, this is as South Africa's not safe. I mean, I've worked over there. I was asked to go with a delegation of police officers, and I actually worked in Johannesburg for a period of time. And I have to say, it's a terrifying place, and I haven't seen it as a tourist. I've seen it more from the law enforcement perspective. And when we were certainly there, 70% of their police officers could not read or write, and it still is the murder capital of the world. If you put it in context of the actual year that Riva was killed, 16,259 people were murdered in South Africa. It really is a tinderbox, I felt, and it feels very edgy.
Did you feel unsafe walking around as a woman? I mean, I'm just curious. Did you feel like you were...
The places I was going to, yes. But of course I wasn't there as a tourist, so I didn't see all the things that other people do. I didn't go on safari. I went to Johannesburg, Alexandria. I missed the Soweto part. But for example, in Soweto, when my colleagues were there, they said that people now are killed by being taken up to the top floor of a building and being pushed out the window because it's a cheaper way to kill people. Wow. And just the carjackings, the things that go on there. We've had a number of cases there as well. So, I think because this came up at the trial a lot by Pistorius himself saying, well, it's such an unsafe place, I would absolutely agree with that. I'm not in dispute at all. But what I'm in dispute with is how Botha found the crime scene itself, and if the things that were said by Pistorius were true, then why did he find certain things like the balcony doors open?
Right.
When Pistorius says that he was so terrified that he slept with a gun, and that's what triggered the behaviour.
Right. And when you call this, it's a gated community, yes, but our impression of a gated community is very different than this. This is more like a fortified community. It has big, tall walls with razor ribbon, and it has live security guards 24 hours a day, and it's got a big structure at the entrance and so forth. It's not something that you just easily sneak in anywhere in the community. Is it still at risk? Yes, some houses did get broken into. Yes, some people were robbed, maybe at gunpoint in this neighborhood, but it's a very rare circumstance. And as we'll see when we go through the actual details, there's a lot of inconsistencies with what Oscar says and does and what the evidence actually shows.
Yeah, and it was an 8-foot-high electrified fence with barbed wire and razor strips at the top. So just, it's always really important when you go to a crime scene, as Jim and I know, that you're not just looking at pictures of just one context of it. Actually, going to a crime scene tells you a million things. Right. So that you have that understanding of decision-making too, and what you see. So
Google it, and you'll see that you can see pictures of the actual neighborhood and the entrance and the fence. So you'll actually experience what it's like. It's not what we see here in this country.
Right, and certainly you can see the inside layout of the apartment too. So the first thing that Hilton both noticed was that there was no signs of forced entry, and what he did know was that a bathroom window was open, but he didn't believe that it would be impossible to go through that bathroom window.
It's too small.
It's too small, exactly. So again, if you look at those pictures, you get an understanding of it. And straight from the very beginning, in his mind, he felt that this was murder. And that was something that he had written down, and that's something that he talked about in court. Now, he was an experienced detective. And again, when you look at, what people say, you've got to weigh into somebody's experience of, if you've attended many crime scenes, then you get a sense about what's gone on, decision making. You look for slightly different things than someone who's inexperienced. And that's something that Jim knows a lot about. But there was no sign of forced entry. He was met by Oscar Pistorius, who had washed his hands, which instantly made him feel concerned about why would it be on their mind to wash their hands when your partner is lying on the ground, either still breathing or dead. And he also found, the fact that Oscar Pistorius had moved her body was concerning to him too. So Pistorius had actually dragged her down the stairs, and she was so no longer in the bathroom, which of course creates a problem in terms of crime scene assessment and analysis.
Contaminating the crime scene.
Yeah, and we know a lot about when people do that.
What their intention is.
So Pistorius's account was that an intruder, he thought, had gone into the bathroom. Now, again, with the bathroom, you have to look at the detail of this, because there's a bigger bathroom area, which the bath is in, and then you've got a smaller cubicle, which is where the toilet is. Mm-hmm. And again, you've got to understand that, because actually the cubicle is very small. It's not a big area that we're talking about. And so Botha was instantly suspicious, as was I when I actually saw the crime scene photos, but of course I haven't stood there, and standing there tells you a very different story. That if someone were in there, that the acoustics would probably lend itself that you would know who was in there, and the fact that she had locked the door was something that came out later on.
Right. And there are things about that specific fact, the locked door, that are totally inconsistent with Pistorius' statements and his testimony. Basically, he said that he heard the door bang closed and then he shot. But Riva was actually sitting on the toilet when she was shot. The first bullet went into her while she was sitting on the toilet. The door opens out into the bigger bathroom, not into the smaller cubicle. She would not have been able to reach the door to slam it shut while she was sitting on the toilet. So it's impossible for it to have been done the way he said. Plus, he didn't hear the door lock. There was no time for anybody to lock the door after it slammed before he made the first shot. So these things prove that it was closed and locked well before he took the first shot. And that is inconsistent with what he testified about. I think this is why the Court of Appeals, the Supreme Court of Appeals, found him guilty of murder, because it could not have been done the way he said it happened.
And these detailed points are, exactly the nuanced behaviour that when you think about what he said, so if we cover that, which was that he had woken up and he had basically gone out from the balcony to pick up some fans and to bring them back into the bedroom. And he says that he didn't look at the bed to know whether Riva was there, but he got back into bed. He then hears a noise, and he claims that he then goes to the bathroom and
grabs his gun first.
He grabs his gun, and he warns whoever it is that's in there, and then he shoots. One round goes off, and then he discharges 3 others. But if we think about just what might well happen if you are lying in bed and you hear a noise, and if you are genuinely concerned, you first of all look to your partner to know, is it them? Have they gotten up? Is it them making that noise?
And are they okay, right?
And
so you check them first,
to
right?
protect them,
right.
If there is a noise.
Yeah. Or did you hear that? Or, you immediately, I do that with my husband all the time. What was that? Yeah.
You would question, but he doesn't say that that's what went on. He goes immediately into threat mode. And, when we think about Riva, the fact that she was wearing her shorts, I think that's interesting, because when you're lying in bed with your partner and there's only 2 of you in the apartment, why is she semi-clothed and going into a bathroom, into the cubicle, but actually not just going in there to use the facilities, she's taken a phone in there and she locks the door too. Mm-hmm. So her mobile phone was in with her.
Right, and so that's a couple of important details. And, obviously people have their own preferences, but at 3 a.m, when you're using the bathroom, when you're in a relationship where you're staying with that person, when you're living in the same household, do you normally lock the door to the bathroom, or do you leave it unlocked and just close the door?
And we're both. I'm just trying to get a sense of it. So there were both doors. You're saying there's a door and then a door into the little toilet area.
Okay, I'll describe it. So the master bedroom area, off to the right of it, has a fairly long hallway, which then turns into the master bath. And the master bath had the sinks and counters, and there's a window over that. And then to the right of that was the toilet door, and then the shower was a separate area to the right of that, a shower and the bath. So what he says is, when he brought the fans back inside, he heard a noise and immediately thought there was an intruder. So he grabbed his gun from the side of the bed and ran, and that's what was his testimony. He ran down the hallway towards the master bath. He noticed the window over the sinks open, so he immediately thought somebody was in there, and then he heard the door to the cubicle slam shut. And he said, as he was running, he screamed out, "Get the fuck out of my house. Get the fuck out of my house." But when he gave the testimony, he started crying. After he was asked, "What did you scream?" He started crying and crying. And then he said, "I said, get the fuck out of my house. Get the fuck Now you imagine any man wanting to scare somebody out of their house, who would raise their voice 3 octaves to do it? Nobody. Not a single person would ever do that. They lower their voice. Get out of here. Get out of the house, to scare somebody. But in this case, there already been testimony from 2 witnesses, 2 ear witnesses, who heard what they said was a female voice screaming before the shots rang out. And so, again, one of those great staged acts by Oscar Pistorius, he cries before to justify his voice going up several octaves when he's screaming this. But he says he does this as he's coming down the hall. And then as he turns towards the toilet door, it slams shut basically in his face. He's several feet away. He's got the gun pointed out that way, and it just goes off, and he shoots. Well, that bullet actually struck Riva while she was sitting on the toilet. And the next ones, there were 4 shots in total. The second one was towards the front of the toilet, and then the third one was further away from the toilet, and the fourth one was further then away from the toilet, which would, by the way, follow the track of somebody who had been shot while they were on the toilet and then fell forward and were shot again and again. I think 3 of the 4 bullets struck her directly, and the fourth one was a ricochet that hit her. So these are very incredibly well-placed shots for somebody who didn't intentionally try to kill somebody in the bathroom. They were aimed to hit somebody who was sitting on the toilet, not some intruder that was in some threatening pose. Why wouldn't he have shot at standing chest level height for a person who was standing up in that toilet who had just slammed the door on him?
And it's worth pointing out that the why these things are really important is there's no doubt that he shot her in this particular case. It's whether it was he understood that she was behind that door and it was intentional.
Right.
So that's what the first trial was trying to find out and establish. But I certainly think that ear witness, we know the issues with eyewitness testimony. Ear witness, again, quite unreliable. But I re-listened to this particular female ear witness, and her account, she was very sure and very confident it was a female voice that was screaming. And she would not be swayed on that, even though the defence tried to confuse her around pitch and tone and all sorts of things to try and muddy the waters. But she was absolutely steadfast and clear that it was a female voice screaming, and it was a blood-curdling scream, and then 3 more rounds were discharged.
Right. So this is exactly the situation why I believe that Oscar raised the pitch of his voice when he screamed out in court what he had said, what he had claimed to have said when he was just about to shoot into the bathroom. The fact is that ear witness testimony can be unreliable when it is to identify a particular person. In other words, hearing somebody's voice is not a great way to identify a particular person. But when it comes to whether the voice is coming from a male or a female, it's a completely different category. And I don't believe there's any testimony, any research, any proof that that is unreliable. It is simply a matter of are you going to believe this witness or not? And as Laura said, she was steadfast in saying, I did not hear a male voice. I heard a female voice. And even though Oscar played his antics on raising the octave of his voice a number of times when he was screaming in the courtroom, I think obviously the Court of Appeals judges really did not believe that crap. And that if there was a female voice screaming or any voice screaming between the first shot and the second shot, that should have warned him that it was not an intruder in the bathroom, that it was his girlfriend. In fact, I believe he never would have taken the first shot if he didn't know that it was Riva in the bathroom. I think it was intentional, and I think all the other evidence proves this out. And we'll go into a little bit more of that now.
And in the heat of the moment, there could as the prosecution put, there was an argument, and she was looking to leave. And in fact, June Steenkamp said the same, that she was, packing her things, and that's why her jeans were found, sort of folded up, and it looked like she was looking to leave that night. And, he takes a decision. And of course, when these things play out, people are operating under that pressure of that time and at that moment. But it certainly sounds like that earwitness did hear a female, and it was a blood-curdling scream. So someone who was in fear, because you can hear screams, at different times in different neighbourhoods, but actually a blood-curdling scream is something that is going to ring out.
Definitely.
And I think the other thing that's interesting is that, and again, if you watch this back in court, it's who called whom. So Pistorius apparently called security and said what had happened, but he didn't call to a medic, for example, or call the paramedics to try and get medical treatment to Riva, which I find is an interesting point. If someone is lying on the floor and maybe they are still breathing, you would think that the first person that they may call, is the paramedics, in particular, if it's not going to be the police. But there was some confusion just in terms of the security guard saying that the security guard had called him, or actually the records had shown that Pistorius had called the security guard. So there were some questions about that, but certainly that he hadn't called to get her medical help.
Right, but the security guard did testify that he asked him what was going on, and the security guard said, "Is everything all right?" And he said that Pistorius indicated he was fine. He doesn't say, "I need medical assistance for Riva right away." He said, "I'm fine." But going back to what you were saying about the jeans, her clothes, my understanding is that all of her clothes were packed neatly in her bag as if she was going to go, but her jeans were actually turned inside out, as if they had been on her, and in a struggle they were pulled off of her. That is the state that they were in when they were found. So and I think the duvet from the master bed was on the floor, but it was in a place where if Oscar had actually put the fan where he said he put it, then it would have been on top of the duvet, or the duvet wouldn't have been able to fall in that place because the fan would have been there. So again, it's just all things that are inconsistent. But when he first went down that hallway, he said he was running. He ran down the hallway towards the threat with his gun extended out in front of him. And then he gets up in court the other day and walks on the edges of his stump as if that's how he actually moves himself when he's not wearing his artificial legs. It's just a bunch of crap. But when he does go to the bathroom towards the toilet and points his gun there, he says that what he said was, "Get the fuck out of my house, get the fuck out of my house." So we'll play you this performance by Pistorius while he was in the court when he's asked what did he say to the intruder before he shot, and let you decide whether this is actually what you believe he would have said and done, and in this voice.
I screamed, I said, "Get the fuck out of my house. Get the fuck out of my house."
But then he starts shooting. He doesn't allow them to get out of the house. There's no reason for him to shoot unless he intended to kill that person without giving them a chance to retreat, without giving them any opportunity. And it's my understanding, in the actual toilet cubicle, is that the one where it has a tiny little window that the detectives said, both have said, nobody could have gone in and out of?
I don't think it's in the actual toilet cubicle, from my understanding. I think it's in the main sort of bathroom area.
Then that's the one right over the sink. So there's
which
no...
is small. There's no point of exit. If you go into that toilet cubicle, there's no point of exit, which again would make no sense. Either this burglar, did they get caught short and they need to use the toilet? Or why would you, I've never seen that yet, or is it the case, the minute that person goes in there, you're trapped. You haven't got a way to get out of there.
But here's the thing. The fact is that he is saying that he wants the person to get out of his house. But if somebody is threatening you, they don't lock themselves in a bathroom away from you. They come at you. Clearly, this is not a threat. Clearly, this is not somebody who is trying to attack him. So how can he justify pulling that trigger unless he intended to kill the person who was in there? And who did he intend to kill? Perhaps his girlfriend, who was in the middle of an argument with him, who maybe was going to call the police, who maybe was going to leave him. All these things are potentially what went on right before this happened, and it resulted in him murdering Riva.
So, Jim, you've talked a bit about, was he on his... Did he put his prosthetics on, or was he on his stumps that night? And certainly, one of the interesting things that both have said was that when he looked at the trajectory of the bullets, he felt that Pistorius was actually on his legs when he...
On his prosthetic legs?
On his prosthetic legs when the firearm was discharged. That was his account when he was actually at the scene. But I know that there were a lot of issues with the door itself. I mean, the actual door, I believe that they took it off its hinges because they were worried that someone might take it off and take pictures and maybe try and sell this door. That tells you about also South Africa, They kept the door on the floor for a while, I believe, and officers actually walked all over it. So there was contamination with the door in particular. And it wasn't sealed or wrapped when it went off to the forensics labs. And of course, there were a number of experts in court that gave conflicting, certainly Botha's account was that he felt he was on his prosthetic legs and the trajectory pointed to that. And then you had a number of other experts that said differently. So again, there seems to be a question about whether, he had time to actually put his legs on, his prosthetic legs, which means that it's a conscious process that he was thinking through. He would have stopped for a point to put the legs on and then he goes to the door. And of course, he plays into that whole, I was vulnerable because I was on my stumps at the time.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, obviously, that's a forensic detail. I mean, if you're standing up on your prosthetic legs, you can certainly hold the gun lower. But if you're on your stumps, there's just only a certain angle that you could reach up to. But I think there's a range of where you could shoot from. I mean, if you're a trained firearms expert, you probably shoot the same way every time. But if you're not, you might shoot in from various angles. I mean, people hold guns up at eye level. People hold them down at stomach level. And I think that is probably why you can't say with any specificity where that gun was being held. But if it is within that range and he could have actually had his prosthetic legs on, then I think you're right. Then it's just one more indication that he actually deliberately killed Riva Steenkamp, that he did not think it was an intruder. Another thing was that he said it was pitch black in his room, that there was no light at all but for maybe a blue light emanating from one of the recorders or the surround sound from his TV. But he got up and he said he opened the curtain and he opened the doors to his balcony and brought in a fan from outside. The curtains were open at that time, so ambient light from outside would have come in and illuminated the bed where presumably Riva should have been sleeping, and he should have been able to see that. I mean, he actually faced the bed when he put down the fan. So to say that he couldn't see at all in there just fights what actually happened. And then it's almost immediately after he brings in the fan that he hears the commotion from the bathroom area and says he thinks it's a intruder. So again, I think that's a convenient excuse, and that's not actually borne out by the facts. When the neighbor, the doctor, first came in, the doctor said he seemed like he was remorseful. He said it was an accident. Is that remorse, or is that a psychopath thinking quickly and setting up
an explanation and an account?
There you go. They're prone to bursts of rage, but they recover remarkably quickly. And they can think clearly because they're not stressed like you and I would be. They actually, and it's a perfect example is Joran van der Sloot after he killed the second young lady, and immediately, in seconds, came up with the idea, I'll go out with 2 empty coffee cups, say I'm going to get coffee for us, and when I come back, I'll be shocked to find her dead. And he did that even though, well, he didn't know that there were actually cameras right outside the room, and it was obvious that nobody else had entered the room, that he left and came back in the same room, and nobody had entered it in that time period. And of course, she was dead when he came back because she was dead when he left. So how did the door get locked when it was slammed and there was no time between that and the first shot. Well, clearly that's not true. It was slammed and then locked, and then Riva had at least enough time to sit down on the toilet before she was shot. So his testimony on that was completely inconsistent with the facts.
Was there something about the light not working in there as well? I vaguely remember that the light in the toilet wasn't working, which made it bizarre that she actually pulled the door closed and locked it.
Yeah, I don't think I heard that, but that would obviously also indicate that she wouldn't have done that under normal circumstances. It had to be extreme, and it's possible that she could see only because she had her phone on because she was dialing it.
Well, she certainly took her phone in there for a reason, and I know certainly it was days before that she had met up with the next boyfriend. You know, it's not to say that that's who she was texting in the cubicle, but I'm sure if, you know, there was some suggestion that Pistorius had found out about those messages, I'm sure he wouldn't have been very happy. But maybe she was trying to make plans to leave. But I think it's certainly interesting she takes her phone in there with her.
Did they find any texts that were timed at that time of death?
No.
Or
Not that I'm aware of, no.
But another thing was that her stomach contents were full. And he said that they had eaten, I think, 6 or 8 hours earlier. And then by that time, her stomach should have been empty. But she must have, in the scenario that we actually have the facts for, rather than what he says, she must have gone downstairs to eat. But there was an alarm that would have tripped if she went downstairs to eat. So the timing of his whole thing about we were having a great dinner, we then went to bed, and it was hours later that we woke up, that doesn't sound realistic based on the fact of her stomach contents.
Yeah, he'd said they'd gone early to bed, didn't he?
Yeah.
And that, you know, all was peaceful and quiet, and they had an early night, which doesn't resonate, and the evidence doesn't point to that.
Right, and so I think that's a story that he made up so that he could say that we were sound asleep and that, you know, we were totally shocked to find this, or I was totally shocked to find somebody making noise in there, because she had to be very dead asleep at that time. Otherwise, why wouldn't he just say to her, you know, are you okay? Where are you? What's going on? It just doesn't pan out.
And the sequence and timing is the important part there, because if his account, with all these inconsistencies, it's not just one or two. We've kind of highlighted a number, and there's far more, but we can't get into all of the detail of it, but we will do in one of our next episodes, because it would be good to just talk a little bit about both some of the other witnesses that were called, certainly some of the experts. Jim, I think there's some questions for me about, you know, what really does make up an expert witness? What kind of credentials and qualifications do you have to have in South Africa? Because there was, for me, just some concern about their, you know, some of the testings that they did, particularly with sounds and the scene visits. Yeah.
I thought it was ridiculous when they did these, quote, scientific experiments testing, well, what does it sound like when the bat hits the door, and could it sound like a shot? Well, that's just outrageously ridiculous.
It was so bizarre. I've got to say, listening to all of that, it was a standout thing of, is that really being entered into evidence?
Yeah. And it seemed like there were no standards at all for expert testimony there. And to have some guy hitting a door with a bat in an open field as opposed to what it sounds like inside an apartment, I mean, it's just ridiculous.
It was worse than a school science experiment.
Yeah,
I mean,
and just, you know, so you know, if you've never actually been near somebody who actually fired a weapon, there's a very distinctive sound when a bullet is fired. And you can actually, if you're actually an experienced law enforcement officer who has shot 5,000 or 10,000 rounds in his career, you will know, you can tell the difference between fireworks going off and somebody actually shooting a gun. And actually, during FBI training, we actually all have to sit at the end of the firing range underneath the berm so we can't get hurt. But they shoot all the different rounds from different types of handguns and machine guns over our heads so that we can hear what the rounds sound like, not only when they leave the gun, when the gun goes off, but also when they fly through the air past your ears. Because this way, if you're in a firefight, you'll be able to identify what's being shot at you. I mean, it's a protective training. exercise, and it actually works. And in my real life here in LA, I've heard a number of shots go off, and I've called the police and been able to tell them what kind of a weapon was being used, at least, the difference between a shotgun and a handgun, and in some cases, an automatic weapon. So the fact is that you can actually tell the difference, and no bat hitting a door is ever going to sound anything like what a gun sounds like.
Can I just say, I don't even know what you're talking about with a bat. I mean, will
They
people
did it.
know? Okay.
Okay. In court, they actually put in as evidence testimony from a quote expert saying that the sound of the gunshot that this woman heard was actually afterwards, after he had shot, after he had realized Riva was not in the bed, and he took a cricket bat and hit the door, broke it in because it was locked, so he could reach in and unlock the door and then get to Riva. So they're saying that sound, the bat hitting the door, was actually what this woman heard, and the voices and the screaming was actually after the shots had already all been fired.
So we have a lot to talk about with this case still. I want you guys to tell me all the rest of the details of the trial and play out for me what you think really happened, and there's just a lot.
There is a lot, and we will go through next time a lot more of the forensic details and some of the things that came out in court, and also we'll be waiting anxiously to find out what the court actually does in sentencing this convicted murderer. On
July the 6th, sentencing will take place. So the judge has a lot to consider, and I'm sure, there's politics in here too, because as Jerry Nell said, he wanted to ensure that a strong message was sent out, because South Africa is a very, it is the murder capital of the world. So everybody's watching to see what happens in this case.
Right. And remember, hashtag her name was Riva.
So I have a recommendation. I was just thinking back to some of the great shows that I've seen, and one of them in particular harks back to Sally Wainwright, who obviously Sally Wainwright of Happy Valley, and of course we know it ain't that happy in Happy Valley. But there's another show that actually the first time that I was aware of her work was a show called Unforgiven, and it was a 3-part drama series that was really well done, and I don't want to spoil it, so I'm not even going to say anything about the plot, but you think you know what's going on, and it takes so many different twists and turns, and there's a brilliant actor in it called Saran Jones, who I really like as well. So you can have a look at it, you can Google it, and I believe you can watch it online. So I hope you enjoy that.
Great. And I'd like to make 2 recommendations. First of all, I hope that everybody is watching or has watched Missing Dial on Nat Geo channel, National Geographic channel, on Sundays at 7 p.m. It's about the hunt for the missing child of Roman Dial. Cody Dial went missing while he was hiking through Costa Rica, and we sent a team down there to figure out what happened to him and try to resolve that mystery. Also, there's a great book that I was actually a part of called Boy, A Woman Listening to Men and Boys. And it's written by Hathaway Barry, and it's a really heartfelt look at different stories of the lives of men and boys. And it's just a fascinating world of how boys look at the world.
And you're in this book.
I am in this book. My story is in this book, and I hope that people read it and that they enjoy the different perspectives that are presented there.
I hope there's a picture of you in this as a
There
boy.
is no picture of me as a boy. There is not. You will have to come and see one of my presentations if you want that.
So in New York right now, there's a play running on Broadway called Waitress. It was nominated for a Tony Award, and it's based on the film also called Waitress that was written and directed by Adrian Shelley. Waitress is a very quirky, wonderful little film starring Kerry Russell, and Adrian herself actually also has a little part in it. And the film is about a wife who has a very abusive and overbearing husband, and how she copes with it in some very interesting ways. But the reason that I'm bringing up the play and the film is that even though Waitress has won a bunch of awards and was shown at Sundance, and Adrian worked very, very hard to bring the project to life. She actually never got to see it celebrated the way it has been, and that's because Adrian Shelley was murdered just before she got the notice from Sundance that it was accepted into the festival. She was murdered in her office by a worker who was working in the building, who came in to steal something from her office, and she caught him, and he strangled her. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also staged it to look like that she had actually killed herself. And thankfully, after her family told the police that she was definitely not somebody who would have killed herself, she had a young daughter, she was happily married, she just has this film that was on the verge of breaking through. And finally, the police, to their credit, looked a little more closely into the crime scene and realized that indeed there was a mysterious shoe print in the bathroom where her body had been hung. Anyway, so they did catch the guy who killed her. And I just want to say that if you haven't seen the movie or you haven't gone to see the musical in New York, I would urge you to, in celebration of Adrian's life, and I think that you'll really enjoy it. You can watch the movie on Netflix, or it might be on Amazon as well. And if you're in the New York area, you can go see the play and support the dream of Adrian Shelley. So that's what I have today.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for listening to Real Crime Profile, and we'll be back again shortly.
Hey, so if you like our show and you want to help, there's a couple things you can do. You can head over to iTunes and leave us a good 5-star review. You can like our Facebook page where you can comment, ask questions, and be part of some great discussions. Or, best of all, you can share us with your friends and anyone who has a real interest in real crime. Thanks for listening.
For advice or support if you're experiencing stalking in the UK, you can contact Paladin National Stalking Advocacy Service on 0207 840 8960 or go on the website www.paladinservice.co.uk. If you're experiencing domestic violence, call the National Domestic Violence Helpline free phone 0800 2000 247. In the US, if you're experiencing domestic abuse and need advice, shelter, safety or counselling, call the Genesis 24-hour hotline 214-946-4357 or go on the website www.genesisshelter.org, or you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline on 800 799 7233.
Real Crime Profile is produced and edited by Paul Francis Sullivan, engineered by Jacob Moose Molin. Music is composed and performed by Simba Sumba. Logo art by Rob Cohen. Real Crime Profile is produced and recorded at Empire Studios LA by XG Productions. Real Crime Profile is distributed by Wondery.